Our next speaker will be Dr. Tom Papademetiou. He is the Constantine and Georgiou Endowed Professor of Greek History and Director of the Dean C. and Zoe S. Pappas Interdisciplinary Center for Hellenic Studies of Stockton University. His research concentrates on the history of non-Muslims under Ottoman rule. He also directs the Anatolian Churches Project. Please welcome him.
Thank you for the introduction, and it's hard to follow presentations on holy fools, so bear with me in my presentation. First, I'd like to, Your Eminences, Reverend clergy, Reverend monastics, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the organizers of this important conference, Father Stephanos, Dr. Young, for your work, and also to acknowledge Art Demopoulos and those who prepared the wonderful lunch that are sponsoring for us. It's a great honor and pleasure to be among you today, in particular as an Ottoman historian in the world of Byzantium, past and present. I'm humbled to present my work here among brilliant scholars of religion and society in the Byzantine Empire, and I'm also privileged to be in the company of monastic luminaries and dedicated clergy, contemporary practitioners of much of what we're discussing during this conference. In the hagiography of Haji Bektash Veli, a mid-13th century Anatolian Sufi mystic and founder of the Bektashi order of dervishes that become deeply associated with the Ottoman Janissaries, Haji Bektash discerned a great need of a distant Christian monk in his community during a time of terrible famine in Anatolia. In response, Haji Bektash selected one of his followers, a dervish, to deliver to the monk an animal loaded with grain. As the dervish traveled to his destination, there were others who approached him to buy this grain, and so the dervish used this opportunity to sell the grain at a great profit. He filled the empty bags with straw and dust. And when he reached the monastery, the Christian monk offered him whatever modest hospitality he could. Impressed by this hospitality, the dervish then began to think that this monk would make an excellent dervish. Discerning this, the monk stated that he was already a Muslim, but he would not wish to be such a Muslim as would betray his master as the dervish had. At this, the dishonest dervish felt sorrowful, realizing that the Christian monk was in fact a holy man, an evliya. At that moment, the Christian monk explained he had to conduct the divine service, and after he met the dervish again, led him down to a hidden underground room. In that room, the dishonest dervish saw a dervish cap, dervish garments, a mihrab, and a stand for holding the Quran. The monk then put on the cap and garments and prayed before the mihrab, reciting verses from the Quran. He revealed that he already was himself a Bektashi dervish, and after his prayer, he put on his monk's robe again and exited upstairs to the monastery. While this hagiography of Haji Bektash has syncretistic implications, it's clearly a Sufi hagiography for a Sufi audience. Yet, it's interesting because it demonstrates how, for common people, including Bektashi dervishes who would be paying attention to this story, monks were understood to be holy men. Their prayers, their generosity, their philanthropy, and powers of discernment reveal the real possibility that monks and dervishes perform similar functions and fulfill a common need in society for all people. The Ottomans were well aware of monks and the role they played in society. The historian Spiros Vrionis argued that the experience of the late Byzantine monastic culture, in fact, was an important component of the dramatic cultural transformation that would take place from being primarily Christian and Greek to becoming Muslim and Turkish in Anatolia. The social, philanthropic, and cultural missions of monasteries and monks were replaced by the Sufi counterparts, the dervish tekke and the mystical Sufi. Briones argues that the function of Christian monks and monasteries was replaced by this fluid Sufi dervish mysticism and is responsible for the majority of conversions of Asia Minor. Elsewhere, I have argued that there was also a significant crisis in leadership which demanded the reappearance of a holy man at this period in time in the 13th century. Hesychasm was embraced and championed by St. Gregory Palamas and Christian anchoritic figures like St. Maximus Kafsokavlivitis and St. Hilarion of Didimotichon, and they were sought after by peasants and emperors alike. Eventually, they would be replaced by Jalaluddin Rumi and the figure of Haji Bektash. Among the first ever recorded sources about the Ottomans is a description by the noted monk and bishop, the saint and champion of hesychasm, St. Gregory Palamas, who describes his experience with the second Ottoman Sultan Orhan. St. Gregory had been captured off the coast of Asia Minor by Ottoman forces who held him for ransom. While awaiting ransom, St. Gregory stayed at the monastery of St. Hyacinthos in Nicaea and even preached in the great church of the city. The fact that Christians were free to host him and a monastery still functioned indicated the Ottomans had a policy of accommodating local Christians and their monasteries. Yet, what was the overall fate of Byzantine monasteries and monasticism under Ottoman rule? So in this brief presentation, I decided to follow in the footsteps of the noted Byzantine historian who's here today, Alice Mary Talbot, who as late as 1987 published an article with the title Introduction to Byzantine Monasticism. With this late date of her introduction to monasticism, it may seem surprising, but Alice Mary Talbot felt that the Byzantine monasticism is one of the most significant and little-known aspects of Byzantine and church history, and it was important to offer introductory remarks. And I consider this paper and this presentation as a similar introduction to monasticism in the Ottoman era, even as scholarship on monasticism in Ottoman society has been steadily increasing. The recent body of scholarship on monasticism in the Ottoman era is due largely to a cadre of Greek scholars of the Ottoman Empire who read Ottoman, Greek, and Slavic sources. Scholars like the late Elizabeth Zachariadou and John Alexander from Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, along with his students Fokian Kozayoris and Ilias Kolovos, scholars like Evgenia Kermeli and even Molly Green, who have done enormous work on the intersection of the history of the Greek Orthodox subjects and the Church in the Ottoman Empire. Yet the field of study of monasticism in the Ottoman era, at least in the non-Greek scholarship, is still in its infancy. So return to the question. What was the overall fate of the Byzantine monasteries under Ottoman rule? The first thing we need to understand about the Ottoman Empire is that it ruled for 700 years over massive territory stretching from the Adriatic and Black Seas to the Arabian Sea, with territory that encompasses the land of the Balkans, Anatolia, the Middle East, and North Africa. As a multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and multilingual empire marked by Islamic culture, it treated its religious minorities and institutions differently over time. While Byzantine monasticism is found throughout the entire Ottoman world, for today's presentation, I'll focus my examples on either Greece or Asia Minor. Historically, monks and monasteries were very practical in their negotiations with whichever state exercised rule over them. Under Ottoman rule, Byzantine monasteries were able to preserve large portions of their widespread holdings and to continue to survive as important monastic centers throughout the following centuries. The Ottomans had a direct benefit from monastic cooperation. First, they received financial benefits to the state. Second, they gained prestige among Christian subjects for being benevolent protectors of the monasteries. Keeping these issues in mind, the experience of the monastery can help us understand how Ottoman rulers treated their Christian subjects. The examples of Mount Athos and the monastery of St. John Prodromos in Serres are perhaps the most important examples of the monasteries in the early Ottoman era. From their inception, these monasteries were under the direct care and stewardship of Byzantine imperial patrons. Caught in the struggle between Byzantium and the Serbian kingdoms, and suffering numerous invasions by Turkic pirates and raiders from among the various Anatolian emirates, the monasteries of Mount Athos and Serres sought to preserve their existence by engaging with local authorities. In the face of an unstable political and military landscape, not only did they want to protect themselves, but they wanted also to protect their smaller, dependent monastic communities, the Metochia in Thrace, Macedonia, and the islands that were essential to the economic maintenance of the actual monasteries. Attacks leveled against the monasteries of Mount Athos from Turkmen pirates continued until tribute agreements were drawn up between the monasteries and the raiding pirates, and decreased in number from the mid-14th century onward. After 1350, there was a renewed feeling of general safety on Mount Athos that encouraged increased patronage, restoration, and repopulation. The changing climate, from being under siege to being stable and prosperous, was connected to the Ottoman recognition of the status of the monasteries of Mount Athos. From the 1370s to the 1420s, Mount Athos again suffered when it was caught in the crossfire between the Byzantines and the Ottomans. Lasting stability came when the monasteries definitively capitulated to the Ottomans in the early 15th century. The capitulations allowed the monasteries to continue their prosperity and maintain their possessions under Ottoman rule. The vast monastic estates produced vibrant revenue that included agricultural production from grains, vineyards, and livestock. Managing and controlling this aspect of the ecclesiastical economy was an important step for the Ottomans, not only to gain control of a large indigenous institution, but also to reap the benefits from such a large economic resource from taxation. The oldest surviving document issued by an Ottoman sultan to a monastic institution is a tax exemption granted to the monastery of St. John Prodromos in Serres. Murat I issues a hukum, a document that survives in Greek only. It's dated around the end of 1372, and Murat ordered the monks of the monastery to be set free from taxes from their villages, lands, and mills. None of Murat I's successors nor their dependents were to ever cause the monastery trouble, and if anyone chose to denounce the monks in court, that person must himself be dismissed. Although this document is brief and extremely vague, it does show how a relationship was established between the Ottomans and a monastic complex in the countryside. The monastery was free to exist without harassment from the Ottomans. By the time Sultan Mehmed II came to power for the second time, in 1451, the Ottomans were trying to determine the best way to govern this unconventional church institution. The ambivalence with which they began to incorporate monasteries into the Ottoman system, the ad hoc manner, demonstrates that the Ottomans were still not fully certain as to the most advantageous practices to deal with monasteries. The Ottomans continued their recognition of monastic rights and privileges, but the documentary record illustrates an increase in monastic taxation, especially of dependent houses, from the late 15th and 16th century. The monks were not as successful in maintaining their properties intact as they had been during the turbulent early years. Previously, resident monks received a special tax status, which allowed them to be taxed not on a per capita basis, but in a lump sum. A monastery, therefore, was assessed a yearly sum without regard to the number of inhabitants. In addition, they had long held Ottoman imperial exemptions, which meant that they were not subject as individuals to the non-Muslim head tax, the jizya. In all these policies, granting rights and exemptions were very much an ad hoc operation based primarily on a principle of istimalet, which is identified as accommodation. The ad hoc nature became codified in sultanic law, which differs from Islamic law, which will be described next. While 1453 is seen as a turning point in world history, Sultan Selim's conquest of the Mamluks of Egypt in 1517 is perhaps even more consequential as it relates to the governance of Christians and their churches and monasteries. It is in 1517 that Sultan Selim I brought the holy Islamic cities of Mecca and Medina directly under Ottoman control and became the custodian of the holy cities and caliph. As a result, Ottoman attitudes and administrative practices would take a dramatic and more traditional Islamic turn. It is during this 1517 campaign that the Ottomans also took control of the territory that included St. Catherine's Monastery. At this event, the monks of St. Catherine's Monastery undoubtedly presented Sultan Selim a special protection document, the Ahidnameh, or covenant document, that was attributed to the Prophet Muhammad and that had the mark of his hand placed upon it. The document was said to be issued by the Prophet Muhammad in the year 628 AD and is described as a covenant to those who adopt Christianity near and far, to defend them as Christian subjects, not to compel them, nor to remove judges from their jobs, nor monks from their monasteries. No one is to destroy a house of their religion, to damage it, or to carry anything from it to the Muslims' houses. The churches are to be respected. They are neither to be prevented from repairing them, nor the sacredness of their covenants. No one of the nation of the Muslims is to disobey the covenant until the last day, or the end of the world. Incidentally, I had an opportunity to speak with Father Justin earlier today from St. Catherine's, who told me that still this is a cornerstone of the library, one of the important manuscripts. And the authenticity, of course, becomes a question, and let me address that now. But what is significant is that this covenant had been confirmed dozens of times during the preceding Muslim dynasties, in the Fatimid, in the Ayyubid, in the Mamluk era, and in 1517 was brought forward again to the new ruler in Istanbul to be reconfirmed. Sultan Selim I was so interested in this specific document, he took it to the he took the document from the monastery back to Istanbul and replaced it with a certified copy and issued an imperial decree, a ferman, explaining what he had done. When he brought the Ahidnameh to the religious scholars in Istanbul, they deemed it to be an authentic document of the Prophet Muhammad. And the authorized Ottoman copy that was deposited at St. Catherine's subsequently received additional annotations as the monks were able to confirm their rights from additional sultans throughout the Ottoman period. And Father Justin did explain that one of the last sultans, Abdul Hamid II, there's actually a document even confirming the rights specifically from Istanbul. While questions of authenticity of this document have been raised by scholars like Michael Cook and Patricia Crone, a clear and convincing argument in favor of its authenticity was recently published in 2013 by John Morrow, but its authenticity is attested by its repeated confirmations as well by the monastic community and by the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew. At this conquest, Ottoman administration was transformed by an influx of hundreds of Sunni scholars and theologians from Arabia. The existence of a document tied to the Prophet Muhammad granting rights to monks and monasteries was therefore quite significant. The Ottoman move away from the ad hoc sultanic law in dealing with the monasteries, granting rights for practical reasons, was re-evaluated by these religious scholars. Selim's successor, Sultan Suleiman, also known as Kanuni Suleiman, the lawgiver, because of reforms meant to reconcile Ottoman law with Islamic law, did much of this work. This had real consequences, however, for the monasteries. In 1568, the monasteries, the Athonite monasteries in particular, faced a major confiscation scheme devised by the Sultan Selim II. This is a couple generations, a century and a half later. 50 years later, who had an immediate need for cash and tried to confiscate Athenite and other monastic properties. Sultan Selim II used principles of Islamic law to show that these properties were actually not exempt from taxation and should be treated like any other landholding. If for some reason they had not paid their yearly taxes according to traditional landholding regime, or had purchased their properties illegally with false documents, they would revert to the Ottoman imperial treasury. The monasteries always had negotiated away these yearly taxes and did not ever pay them. As a result, they faced the immediate threat of expropriation. The head Islamic jurist, the Sheikhul Islam, Ebu Suud Effendi, issued a fatwa to justify the ruling according to Sharia. Once this happened, the monks, in fact, lost their properties to the state. To get them back, they were forced to gather funds to purchase them. Even with sultanic decree documents from previous sultans, they were unable to make their case. As a result, the monks were forced to make substantial payments to the Ottoman imperial treasury to redeem the monasteries in the region of Thessaloniki and Sardis. Yet, they also aggressively negotiated with the Ottomans, this time basing their appeal upon Islamic law in order to prevent such a thing from happening again. They petitioned to be recognized under the status of pious foundation, wakuf, analogous to an Islamic pious foundation. To get their way, they even threatened to abandon all their monasteries and leave them fallow and so worthless. As a result, Sultan Selim II recognized their status, and Ebu Suud Effendi again issued a fatwa acknowledging each monastery as a wakuf. In consequence, the monasteries were issued wakuf foundation documents, which in the long run became a much more effective way to protect their monastery and holdings. Their legal status was akin to a Muslim pious establishment, and the state thereafter would be unable to alienate the land and property. In other words, there would never be another possibility for the Sultan to confiscate monastic properties without directly conflicting with Islamic law. Thus, as the monks better understood the Islamic legal system and integrated their monasteries into it, they were able to become more and more autonomous. This autonomy and lack of encumbrances led to greater and greater activity and even creativity. So in the next part of my paper, I'll address a few elements. I won't be speaking on spirituality or liturgy and other things that are more theological, but I'll deal with economy, education, and artistic culture, and then I'll conclude. In terms of economic activity, monasteries were able to participate in the cultivation of grains, olives, grapes, livestock, and many other products that could be produced for in-house consumption, but could also be sold at market as well. Their land holdings, most of which were donations by Christian populations, were sometimes so vast that they existed far beyond the location of the monastery, on distant islands, such as the Metohia on the islands of Limnos. This, of course, made the monks seafarers as well. Elizabeth Zachariadou demonstrated that monasteries used their relative freedom of movement to engage in maritime transit. In fact, she argues that the small fleets that monasteries developed on the seacoast to exchange their agricultural products or to bring them from distant islands, from Limnos to Mount Athos, were precursors to the development of maritime fleets in the Aegean in general. There are also examples of extensive economic activities on the island of Crete in the aftermath of the Ottoman takeover in the 1670s, where monks engaged in a full variety of agricultural production and maritime trade. Education was also especially evident in monasteries. There are records of monastic schools opening throughout the Ottoman Empire in the 17th and 18th centuries, in the mountains of Evrytania, with the likes of Saint Eugenios Iannoulis or Etolos and his compatriot Saint Cosmas or Etolos, who established countless schools within monasteries throughout Greece as they preached the divine mission of education. Monasteries also continued the sacred mission of maintaining and copying manuscripts. Their libraries remain to this day among the greatest repositories of classical, biblical, theological, and even scientific manuscripts. The freedom to establish educational centers, unharassed by the state, extended to include the Athenite Academy, established in 1749, that became one of the most important schools of high-level education in Greece. Directed by figures like Evgenius Vulgaris. It is one of the important centers contributing to the modern Greek Enlightenment. Other important figures associated with the academy and fierce opponents, incidentally, of Evgenius Vulgaris are people like St. Athanasius of Paros, St. Macarius of Corinth, who had as his protege St. Nicodemos the Aioriti, the Hagiorite. St. Nicodemos began his career of studying, copying, editing, writing, and publishing multiple religious and spiritual texts that include 26 books, multiple smaller works including hymnography. Among the most important is the Philokalia, the major collection of sayings and vitae of the great ascetic figures such as St. Anthony the Great, St. Maximus the Confessor, and St. Simeon the New Theologian, focused on the practice of hesychasm and spiritual struggle. And with these, everyone is familiar. Visual culture ought not to be forgotten in our brief overview, as it was in monastic workshops that icons continued to be produced for worship and for individual use in the home. With the proliferation of workshops in Crete, mainly in Greece, and as in north in Romania, Mount Athos and the monasteries of Meteora became important centers for training iconographers and for producing icons. It is during the Ottoman era, in the beginning of the 18th century, that the important figure of Dionysios of Fourna trained on Mount Athos and became proficient to paint the chapel of St. Demetrius of the monastery of Vatopedi. Even more significant is that he produced a manual for iconographers called the Mount Athos Painter's Guide that included directions on how to create color and pigment, how to compose icons with figures and inscriptions, and how the iconographic program should work within the church. This manual continues to guide contemporary iconographers. And so now I'll conclude with a story of a monastery that is back in the heart where monasticism began in Cappadocia, the land of St. Basil. However, the story is coming to us from the 20th century. I want to return to the idea of the perception of the monk as a holy man recorded in an oral history of a late Ottoman Greek Orthodox villager from Zinci-Dede, a village nearby Caesarea, the city of St. Basil. Emmanuel Tsalikoglu explained, and these, let me preface this, these were oral histories that were collected by an organization called the Center for Asia Minor Studies in Athens, and the people being interviewed were part of the displaced population, the exchanged population from Asia Minor. So these are the Greek Orthodox from Asia Minor. In 1923 is when the treaty happens, and of course, these interviews are taking place in the 1950s. Emmanuel Tsalikoglu explained that the monastery's first foundation, and this is the monastery of St. John Prodromos in Zinci-Dede, its first foundation was laid in 1728 on a pre-existing church of St. John Prodromos. And later, in 1804, they built the magnificent church that stands to this day. And today it's actually in the middle of a Turkish army base. The monastery was famous, and pilgrims came for its feast of the beheading of St. John Prodromos on August 29th, and stayed for the fair that took place for 10 days. During that time, pilgrims stayed in guest houses and enjoyed all sorts of goods, food, and sweets. They celebrated their religious festivals until the population exchange in 1923. The monastery also had an underground chapel dedicated to the healing saint, St. Panteleimon. Because of his healing power, St. Panteleimon attracted not only Greek Orthodox Christians, but also Armenians and even Muslims. The chapel was especially dedicated for those who suffered mental illness and epilepsy. The Greek Orthodox pilgrims would stay from Saturday night to Sunday for the liturgy, and the Muslims would spend Thursday night to Friday, their holy day. Emmanuel Tsalikoglu then states the following. During the summer of 1906, I witnessed a Muslim who had lost his mind enter the underground chapel. They brought him tied on a horse with ropes, accompanied by 2 relatives. After spending 2 days inside the underground infirmary, the insane man was seen returning home, riding a horse, peaceful, calm, and free of bonds. This incident was not the only one. It happened often, as everyone who ever lived in Zingitere knows that the insane regained their lost mental balance. And he adds, the small, dark temple of the monastery of Flaviana, which is kind of an older name for this, had alleviated and tamed the religious fanaticism of the Muslims. With faith, devotion, and humility, they respected the monastery, the monks or the priests who lived inside it, and even the healer called Evliya, just like the Christians did. It is clear from this observation of a local Cappadocian monastery in 1906 that from the very first interaction with Byzantine monks until their last in 1923, the Ottomans understood the importance of monks and monasteries and knew a holy man when they saw them. Thank you.